Stephen White, who is behind me, is born in Framingham, Massachusetts, is of Acadian descent on his father's side. In 1966, he began to do Acadian genealogy. He has an he graduated from Harvard with a magna cum laude. In 71, he was at JD University of Pennsylvania, and in 71, he was also admitted to the Massachusetts bar. From 72 to 75, he practiced law in Massachusetts, and in 75, we as Acadians were fortunate to have him hired at the Centre d'études acadiennes, which is at the University of Moncton. And in 1970 to date, members of he's been a member of several genealogical and historical organizations in Canada and in New England. He is a founding member, judge, and has been Secretary Registrar of the Genealogical Institute of the Maritimes, which grants professional accreditation to a genealogist. And in 1983, he became a certified genealogist. He's been the author of several periodicals, Les Cahiers de la Société Historique Acadienne, French-Canadian and Acadian Genealogical Review, New England Historical and Genealogical Register, Nova Scotia Historical Quarterly. Other publications include Les Acadiens de Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon à La Rochelle, between certain years, Note de l'abbé Patrice Galland, Registre de l'abbé Charles-François Bailey, Centre d'études acadiennes, a chapter in the Genealogist's Handbook of Atlantic Canada Research, La généalogie des 37 familles hôtesses des retrouvailles 94. Dictionnaire généalogique des familles acadiennes, première partie, between the years 1636 and 1714. That's in 2 volumes, and we're anxiously awaiting the other books that he's got on the go. English supplement to the Dictionnaire généalogique des familles acadiennes. And I could go on, but you don't want to hear me. I know you've come to hear him. So without further ado, I will introduce Mr. Stephen White.
Good afternoon. I am Stephen White. I've been introduced. I thought that was fairly boring. My resume doesn't interest me very much. I'm here to talk about Fougeres. How many of you here are Fougeres? That's a pretty good number. So you all descend from Jean Fougere, who came to Acadia in the early 18th century. You probably already know that, but I'm going to cover a lot of the same material that is available on any number of websites and so on. And I thought that what might be interesting if I could explain to you something about how we know all these things about people who lived so long ago. As to how all this information got on the websites, it's very simple. I can tell you that most people copied what I put together in my research. And if they didn't copy from me, they probably got it wrong. So, now, why should I be interested in Jean Fougere? I suppose some of you are wondering about that. It's because I descend from Jean Fougere too. Or I should say, I descend from Jean Fougere 8, because I descend from him 8 times. As I'm sure you are all aware by looking at the information that's posted and so on, Jean Fougere had 18 children. He was married twice and he had 18 children. And of the 18 children, we know that 11 children were married and had further offspring. And I'm going to get much more into detail about that in a few minutes. And I descend from 5 of the 11 children that Jean Fougere had who were married. 3 children from his first marriage, Marguerite, Jeanne, and Charles, and 2 children from the second marriage, Judith and Barbe. And I'm sure that there are many people in here, in the hall, who descend from Jean Fougere more than once, because the Fougeres are a very important family in this area for some reasons that I'll explain in a minute. And they've been here for such a long time that there were, over the course of the generations, intermarriages, and that's how we have these multiple descents. Now, just to summarize very briefly, Jean Fougere is one of those Acadian ancestors about whom we're very fortunate because we know where he came from. He arrived in Acadia sometime before 1709. We know that because we have his signature in the Register of Port Royal dating from 1709. And he was married at Port Royal in 1713. And we have his marriage record, and that tells us where he's from. Some of the other Acadian families, such as the, am I allowed to say Boudreau in here? Is this going to cause any problems? Like the Boudreaus, we don't know where Michel Boudreau came from. He came 2 generations earlier than Jean Fougere, and the records from that time don't survive. So we don't have his marriage record, and we don't know where he came from in France. But we do know where Jean Fougere was from. He was from a little place called Poupry, and Mrs. McKay over there was asking me about where that might be, and it's in the Diocese of Orléans, in the area called La Beauce in France. And we know that his parents were another Jean Fougere and Marie Barré, according to his marriage record. There's a copy of the marriage record in a frame over there, and for any of you who would like to take the challenge of reading Father Justinien Durand's scribbles, then you can go and look at that, because unfortunately Father Justinien Durand, who was the pastor of Port-Royal. You want me to speak more loudly? I thought I was shouting. Okay, can you hear me in the back over there? All right. The acoustics in here aren't the very best, but in any event, Jean Fougere came from this little place in France, and he came here. We don't know why he came to Acadia, but he met a girl and he liked her, so he got married, and he married this girl named Marie Bourque, who was the daughter of Abraham Bourque. And that had a certain amount of importance later on. As I said, they were married in 1713, and then they came out to Cape Breton in 1721, and they set up shop at Port Toulouse, which, as I'm sure you all know, is the area around St. Peter's, or perhaps more specifically around Grand Grève. And we know they came out about 1721 because of the various records we have. We have the registers of Port Royal. We know when their children were born there. And then we have the records, the census records from Port Toulouse to give us an idea of when they arrived, because he's mentioned in a census in 1722. Now, Jean Fougere set up in Port Toulouse. He was quite successful, as far as we can tell from the records. The censuses tell us he was a navigator. And we know he had what was called an habitation de pêche. He had set up a business, fishing, and employed men in this fishing. And he had 3 men working for him in 1724 and 8 in 1726. So he was pretty well fixed as far as that sort of thing goes. But he had the misfortune after a few years to lose his wife, Marie Bourque. But he remarried. He married a second time to Marie Madeleine Béliveau and had a second family, as you know. Now, some of this information is a little bit trickier to put together than you might think at first glance. From the point at which he was married in Port Royal until he came out here, we can trace the family very readily in the parish registers in Port Royal. But then, coming out here to Port Toulouse, there's a complication, because there were registers kept at Port Toulouse, of course, and after the fall of Louisbourg in 1758, those registers were taken off to France, and they were deposited in the French archives, and then the French archivists lost them, which was not very nice for our purposes, because it makes it much more difficult to put these sorts of details together to reconstruct the history of the family. Now, in the French archives, before they lost the registers, the government hired a man named Joseph Arin to take charge of the records, and he drew up a kind of an index to all the records. He made these sort of an abstract. He gives you all the names of the people. He mentions if it's a baptism, a marriage, or a burial, that sort of record it is. And he gives us the volume and page number in the original registers, which are no longer around. Now, Because we have certain censuses, and because some people bore distinctive names, we can identify some of the people in his index readily and conclusively, and from that we can pinpoint the time, from the ages of these people in the censuses, we can pinpoint the time of the record, the original baptismal record. Then we know that on that page of that volume, the record's dated from that time. And something I did quite a long time ago was I sat down with all that, and I was able to reconstruct most of the Port Toulouse register from judging roughly the ages, the dates, and so on, and then you can put it together so that you can figure out when certain people were born from the censuses, and then you can tie that into the index. Of course, I had to put all the names back in the original order rather than the alphabetized order that he used. But what I learned from that was that Marie Bourque died about 1727. We wouldn't know that otherwise, but we know there's a burial record for her on a certain page in a certain volume of the registers that are lost, and we know that that burial took place around 1727 because we can date other records that happen to fall on the same page. Now, the question that came out in this is that other genealogists thought for a long time that the Jean Fougere, who married Marie-Madeleine Béliveau, was the son of the original Jean Fougere rather than the original Jean Fougere himself. But the way we can prove that it was the original Jean Fougere is that there was another census in 1734, and in that census it shows that Jean Fougere, who was living and married at Port Toulouse, and there was just the one, he was born in France. So he's the father and not the son who was born in Acadia. Now that sort of a problem is fairly simple to sort out as long as you know how to put the information together and read it properly. The more complex problem that came out of the research into these families, into the Fougere family in particular, is sorting out the generations that came later on. Because as I mentioned, Jean Fougere was married twice and had 18 children. Some of the children appear in Larocque's census of 1752. Some are only mentioned in the indexes to the registers of Port Toulouse. Once we can date the registers of Port Toulouse, or the entries from the registers of Port Toulouse more or less as to what dates they should have originally been compiled in, then we can conclude that they're all Jean Fougere's children because he was the only head of family at the particular time. You see? So that's how we come to this compilation of the 18 children of Jean Fougere from looking at these index records, because there were several of his children who died young, and they would not be known to us at all if their names weren't in the table alphabetique of this Sieur Aran, who compiled the index, the table alphabetique for the registers of Port Toulouse that are now lost. Of course, if the French archivists hadn't lost the registers, we would know a lot more about this. We would have the exact information from all these baptismal records of the different children of Jean Fougere who were born in Port Toulouse. And we don't know exactly what happened to Jean Fougere because he was apparently still living in 1745, but there's no mention of him after the French repossessed Ile Royale in 1749. There's no mention of him. And in about 1750, his widow, Marie-Madeleine Béliveau, married again. She married a man named Claude Dugas, and she had more children from her second marriage. Now, what makes the Fougere family particularly important here, particularly important in this whole area in Nova Scotia and among the Acadian families in this area, is the fact that the Fougeres make up, through the two marriages of the ancestor Jean Fougere, and if we tack on the second marriage of the widow, we have a large extended family that became, after this area was resettled, beginning in 1761, it became the basis family for the whole population. Now, I referred to the Boudreaux a little while ago, and I'm not here to push the Boudreaux reunion, which is taking place next week. But we all know that there are more Boudreaux around here than flies. So the Boudreaux are very, very numerous. They are the dominant family among the Acadians in this area. But you want to know something about those Boudreaux? They all descend from Fougeres. And the way that came about is through the various marriages of the children and grandchildren of Jean Fougere. As I mentioned, there were 11 children who married. In the first marriage, there was Marguerite, who married Abraham Dugas. There was Marie-Joseph, who married Charles Boudreaux. There was Jeanne, who married Michel Boudreaux. And there were two boys who were married, Joseph, who married Marguerite Coste, and Charles, who married Madeleine Dugas. Then in the second marriage, there was Judith, who married Joseph Boudreaux, and Barbe, who married Louis Boudreaux, Louise, who married Joseph Petitpas, Madeleine, who married François Bonin, and there were two more boys, Jean, who married Marguerite Landry, and Michel, who married Apollonie Martel. But the Boudreaux connections don't stop there, because Marguerite, who married Abraham Dugas, had a daughter, Marguerite Dugas, who married Charles Boudreaux. And Madeleine Fougere, who married François Bonin, had, as far as we know, only one child, Barbe Bonin, who married another Charles Boudreaux. And from these different marriages, from the marriage of Marguerite Dugas, she married Charles Boudreaux, who was known as Madoues. So all the Boudreaux of the Madoues line come from their grandmother, Marguerite Fougere. And the daughter, Jeanne, who married Michel Boudreaux, he was known as Mictot, and the Mictot Boudreaux in West Arichat all descended from that branch. And then there was the other branch, one of her sons is the ancestor of those, and the other son, Joseph, was in Poulemont, and the ancestor of all those Boudreaux, and the Mictot line in Poulemont. And Marie-Joseph married a Charles Boudreaux, and the difference here is that this particular Charles Boudreaux, his lineage ended up over in Cheset-Cook. The Boudreaux were in Cheset-Cook, but they didn't stay there very much. There was one line from their son Pierre, not very numerous, but the big show was from their son Jean, who settled in Guysborough County, and is the ancestor of the Boudreaux in Guysborough County. Now, the other Charles Boudreaux, the third Charles Boudreaux who married into the family, the one who married Barbe Bonin, is the ancestor of the Petit de Gros Boudreaux, the mixed lineage of Boudreaux. So with these different marriages, all the Boudreaux come back to mothers or grandmothers who were Fougeres. And it doesn't stop there by any means, because first off, you have the four sons, the four brothers, two brothers from the first marriage and two brothers from the second, who had themselves a large descendants of Fougeres. Joseph, who married Marguerite Coste, is the ancestor of the Fougeres in Havre-Boucher. But he also had two sons who had descendants in West Arichat. His sons Louis, who married Charlotte Forgeron, and Joseph, who married Apollonie Boucher. And the widow of his son Jacques, she was a Madeleine Petitpas. And she married a second time after Jacques Fougere died. Her second husband was Benjamin Pellerin, and that brought Fougeres into Guysborough County because Madeleine moved with her second husband from where he came from, among the Pellerins in Guysborough County. I'll be talking to the Pellerins in Guysborough County Wednesday. And you have a descendants of Boudreaux that come from Fougeres. Watch that business with the Boudreaux. You have this descent of these Fougeres in Guysborough County who come from Jacques Fougere and Madeleine Petitpas. And then the two youngest sons in the family, Charles and Marcel, are the really big ancestors of the Fougeres in Havre-Boucher, except that you have a crossover. One of Marcel's sons, Dominique, came and settled in River Bourgeois. He married Marguerite Boucher and Adelaide de Cost. It was Dominique Fougere. Then we have the descent of Charles, who married Madeleine Dugas, Charles Fougere. His eldest son, Simon, is the ancestor of the Fougeres in River Bourgeois. And then his son, Boniface, settled in the area around Rocky Bay. And Boniface must have been an interesting character for several reasons. First off, he seems to have been the richest of all the Fougeres at the time, because in the registry of deeds, he was buying and selling land quite often, and he was even taking mortgages on property. So Boniface was apparently quite a successful businessman in a sort of way. Perhaps he was the equivalent of a real estate developer of the time. He was born in 1764, and he only died in 1861. So he also lived a very long life. And Edmé Rameau de Saint-Père, the French historian who came to Acadia in 1860 and visited various areas in Acadia, he had already written a history of Acadia, or about the history of Acadia, in a volume called La France aux Colonies, which was published in France and in Montreal. Edmé Rameau de Saint-Père came and visited with various people in this area. One of the persons he visited and he was very interested in talking with was this Vieux Boniface Fougere. He simply calls him Le Vieux Fougere in his writing, but that's with whom he was talking. He met Boniface Fougere. There was another son of this Charles Fougere who was named Fabien, who married Marguerite Fougere and lived in Arichat. He lived where the Fougères had their grants, their grant of land in Arichat, but he didn't stay on Ile Madame. He moved away. And he was a navigator. He lived in Quebec in various places for a while, and then he was shipwrecked in 1821. And he had a son also named Fabien who settled in the Gaspé Peninsula. His son Fabien married Marguerite Odette and settled at Mariat in Quebec in the Gaspé Peninsula, and that's the ancestor of all those Fougeres in the Gaspé Peninsula. So you see the different branches spread out over time. And the next question, or the big question, is whether indeed Honoré Fougere, who came and settled in New Brunswick, was another son of Fabien. I think he must have been, but I can't find proof of that. Are there any Fougeres from New Brunswick in the audience? Did you descend from Honoré? Oh, there you are. So your ancestor is a problem, so we have to work on that. But the big problem in the Fougeres was really sorting out the Fougeres in Rocky Bay, because there are two big branches of the family who settled in Rocky Bay, and well, I should say there was also, out of the River Bourgeois branch, the lineage of the Fougeres in Poulemont. Michel Fougere married Anne Landry, and Michaud Fougere, and all those Fougeres. That comes from Simon, who was the son of the Charles that I just mentioned. But then there's two other branches of the family. There were the two sons of the second marriage who settled in Rocky Bay, Jean Fougere and Michel. And about 25 years ago or so, I managed to figure out how that worked. But it was kind of tricky, because we have no parish records for Arichat at the time, because they were burned in 1838. Jean Fougere was married in the 1770s or 1760s, and his brother Michel around the same time. They were very close together in age. And we have a couple of baptismal records in Bailly's register for when Father Bailly came here on missionary visit in 1771. But then there's a great big gap in the records until the Arichat registers start in 1839, or the Disuse registers start here in 1832. And it's not that obvious how this works together, how this fits together at this point. But in the 1811 census, we have mention of the various families, and there were 4 Fougeres altogether: Michel, Joseph, Jean, and Pierre. And there's Jean Fougere Sr., And you would think that the Jean Fougere would be Jean Fougere Jr., except it didn't quite work that way. There was also in that census Joseph Hilarion Fougere Jr. And I thought, well, there must have been a Joseph Hilarion Fougere Sr., but that wasn't the case. Jean Fougere Sr. was the father of Joseph Hilarion Jr. Now, why Sr. and Jr. didn't have the same first name, I don't know. But it works out that way. And the way we know that is by the accumulation of various bits of information that tie together in such a way that we can separate the two branches, one from the other. And what we use to sort those things out a lot are land records. And there are a few written records that have survived, recollections of people from the late 19th century. And one thing we're very lucky to have is a letter that was written by a man in Massachusetts named Bernard Partey to Father Guillaume Marin Leblanc in 1898. And Bernard Partey, who was originally from Arichat, was very interested in genealogy. And he had met an old couple, what was the name now? Joseph Boutin and Marine Sampson, I think that. Marie or Marine Sampson. It was this old couple that he had met, and Madame Boutin descended from the Fougeres, and Monsieur Boutin descended from the Fougeres, and Bernard Partey was interested in trying to find out how they were related. And Father Guillaume Marin Leblanc was very interested in genealogy, and he wrote to him and he thought, well, maybe he can give me the clue as to how these two are related. But it's the letter that's of interest. And the reason why I have a copy of that letter, or the reason it still exists, is because sort of a series of coincidences. Actually, what happened was the letter was written to Guillaume Marin Leblanc. Guillaume Marin Leblanc died in 1907 in the rectory in Arichat, the hospital. Not because it was a hospital then, because it was the old bishop's palace that was used as a rectory, and he had a very good friend who was the pastor at that time, Father Lubin Galin, so he was staying there. And I warned Annette that I was going to run dry. Thank you. Lubin Galin had been a protege of Father Leblanc when he was the founding pastor of Saint Joseph du Moine, and that's why they were friendly. But after Father Galin died, he left his notes, his genealogical papers to Father Galin. Father Galin went blind. He needed help financially as well as otherwise. And Father Montbriquet, who was the pastor of Arichat in those days, up until 1946, he wrote to the archives, and he wanted to sell these papers to the archives. Placide Godet, the Acadian genealogist, was working at the archives at the time. They sent the papers up to have them inspected, and Placide said, oh, okay, well, we told the archivist, the Dominion archivist, to give them some money for that, so they bought the papers. Unfortunately, the archives didn't take good care of these records. And a gentleman I knew originally from River Bourgeois named Ephraim Boudreau, who wrote a history of River Bourgeois. I became acquainted with him quite some time, about 30 years ago, and he mentioned to me one time that he had these documents that somebody at the archives had simply passed over to him. And one of the things he had was this letter that Bernard Partey had written to Guillaume Marin Leblanc in 1898. So I got a copy from him of that. The point of all this is that Bernard Partey mentions that there were these certain Fougere girls who were all sisters. That's very important because we wouldn't be able to establish that without the indication, or it would be very difficult to establish that without the indication in this letter that these different Fougeres were sisters. And there was Dorothée, who was married to Juste Montbriquet, and there was Anne, who was married to Celeste, who was married to Firmin Montbriquet, and there were several sisters married to Montbriquets, and there was Charlotte, who was married to Joseph Leblanc in West Arichat, and one or two others. And what's particularly important is the one married to Firmin Montbriquet, because Firmin Montbriquet had a joint land grant with Joseph Hilarion Fougere. The reason he had a joint grant was because they were very closely related. Joseph Hilarion and Firmin's wife were brother and sister. So that's how we can establish a linkage there. And then with other marriages between the two different branches of the Fougeres, Joseph Hilarion had, for example, a daughter, Barbe, who married Michel Fougere, who was the son of another Michel Fougere, whose baptismal record is in Bailly's register, and that shows us that he was the son of the other Michel Fougere. And the fact that they were related in the third degree allows us to conclude that Joseph Hilarion was the son of the brother of the first of the Michel Fougeres. That makes a way of establishing a lineage on the two sides. And then it comes down to a matter of just simply pasting in other people by working out other dispensations and looking at other sorts of records that allow us to unravel the genealogy of the two different branches of the family through that great gap in the parish registers. Then getting back to the idea that this is a very important family because of all the interconnections of not just the men named Fougere, but also the women named Fougere. And it's a funny thing. People always talk about families as though there were only men in them, because they talk about people with just the same names, and the names passed down through the men, so that leaves the women out a little bit. And I noticed that not everybody here is a man, or at least you don't look like all men. And I want to assure you that it's very important to trace both sides of the families. You have to look at the women's side, the mother's side, just as well as the father's side. And in looking at that, we find that the Fougeres had a lot of interesting descendants around here. For example, here in Descousse, you have the church, and you have the glebe house, and that's on land that belonged to Janvier Josse, or John Joyce as he called in the anglicized records in the early 19th century, in the land records particularly. But his real name was Janvier Josse, and his mother was Marie Dugas, and she was one of the daughters of Marguerite Fougere. And Jean Josse gave the land for the church to stand on. So that's kind of interesting. And we have the Dugas in River Bourgeois who descend from that same line of the Dugas. We have Benoits who descend from that same line of Dugas, because Louise Gervais Dugas married Simon Benoit. And we have the Dugas in West Arrachad who descend from Joseph Bernard Dugas. And we have all the Bourques in River Bourgeois who descend from Cécile. And I descend from Sophie, who married Pierre Landry and lived in Poulamont. So, you see, the Dugas are an important family, and they descend from the Fougeres. And from the lineage of Joseph Fougere, who married Marguerite Coste, besides the different brothers who gave us a lot of different Fougeres, we have the daughters Modeste, who married Jean Forêt, ancestor of some of the Forêts in Arrachat, Théotiste, who married Joseph Forgeron, and Thérèse and Marthe, who married brothers named Lavandier. There are a lot of Lavangis who descend from that branch of the Fougere family. And that family that lived over in Chézet-Cook, Charles Boudreau and Marie-Joseph Fougere. Besides the Boudreaux in Chézet-Cook and in Guysborough County, Théotiste married Gabrielle Clerget, the ancestor of the Clergets. Marie married Jean Petitpas, the ancestor of a lot of Petitpas. And Anne married Pierre Bonat, as the ancestor of the Bonats in the Chézet-Cook area. And even from the Mictot-Boudreau line, from Jeanne Fougere married to Michel Boudreau, we have Anne, who married Joseph Thériault, ancestor of many of the Thériots on Ile-Madame. Marguerite, who married Benoni Boucher, ancestor of many of the Bouchers. And actually, in the case of the Thériots particularly, anybody here related to Thériots? Well, that's what you think. Because René Thériault came here with his wife Anne Leblanc, and they had 3 sons. And Joseph married Anne Boudreau, whose mother was Jeanne Fougere, and his brother Simon married Marguerite Boudreau, whose mother was Barbe Fougere, and the third son, the third brother, Victor Thériault, well, he was actually married twice. His first wife was Elizabeth Boudreau, whose mother was Judith Fougere, and his second wife was a Fougere. So every Thériault you can find who comes out of Ville-Madame is related to the Fougeres. And we can go on with the same sort of ideas with some of the other families. The Marchands, who descend from Charlotte Boudreau, whose mother was Judith Fougere, and her sister Marguerite married another Marchand named Adrien Marchand, another Marchand named Adrien. And more of the Bouchers descend from that family. And Sampsons, Cyprien Sanson married Judith Boudreau, whose mother was Judith Fougere. I descend from that couple myself. And Babins, who descend from 2 more sisters. Pierre Babin married Marie Boudreau, and Simon Babin married Madeleine Boudreau. And those are Babins from the Butte des Babins on the one side, and La Pointe des Babins on the other side of Ayrshire. And many other families tie into these same Fougere sisters and brothers of that first generation. Louise Fougere married Joseph Petitpas. She had 2 sons, Jean and Michel, who are ancestors of Petitpas, not just in Tracadie and around Tracadie in Nova Scotia, but also in Newfoundland. A lot of Petitpas who descend from Michel Petitpas and Victoire Giroir in Newfoundland. And then 2 other sisters in that family of the Petitpas married Giroirs, François Giroir and Joseph Nicolas Giroir. And all the Giroirs from Tracadie descend from those 2 brothers who married 2 sisters whose mother was a Fougere. Father Hubert Giroir, who was the first Acadian to be a priest in the Diocese of Antigonish, was a grandson of Angélique Petitpas and a great-grandson of Louise Fougere. And we can go on and on with these different Boudreau families, and there are Héberts who tie into this. I was talking with Arlene, and her ancestor Joseph Hébert married Marie Monique Fougere. There are Martels. The Martels in Rocky Bay descend from Louis Martel and Julie Fougere, and more Montborquets who tie into these families, and also the Bellefontaines and the Beauséjours. And they have a particularly special connection from the fact that the widow of Charles Fougere, the son of the ancestor Jean, his widow Madeleine Dugas married as her second husband Paul Beauséjour. And they had 2 boys, Paul and Michel, who were mostly the ancestors of the subsequent members of the family. There were a couple of other sons, but they kind of drop out of sight. But Paul and Michel. And the interesting thing is that there was a Bellefontaine family, came here from Halifax, came to Ile-Madame from Halifax in the earlier mid-1760s. Anselme Bellefontaine was the father of that family. And he had only 1 son, whose name was Marc Bellefontaine. And Marc Bellefontaine moved away from Ile-Madame, and he moved to New Brunswick. And he took with him his son-in-law, Honoré Fougere. So that's how the Fougeres moved away to New Brunswick from here, in that particular line. But at the same time, that was the last of the Bellefontaines around here. And the Bellefontaines aren't really named Bellefontaine. Their real name is Gaudin. They're one of those French families that has several different names. And another branch of the family is the Beauséjour line. The Beauséjours and the Bellefontaines were cousins, both being from the Gaudins. And what happened was that when Marc Bellefontaine moved away, there were no more Bellefontaines here. And the 2 brothers, Paul and Michel, decided to sort that out by having Michel take the name Bellefontaine. He gave up his Beauséjour name and he became Bellefontaine. So there's a new lineage of Bellefontaines that came up from Michel Beauséjour. And where this ties in particularly is that Paul Beauséjour and Michel Bellefontaine both married Fougères. They both married daughters of Michel Fougere and Apollonie Martel. So keep tying back into the Fougere family. So that's why I say that if you can find somebody around here who doesn't descend from one of the children of Jean Fougere, I'd like to shake their hand, because they need to come in contact with Fougere descendants immediately. They're completely out of touch if they haven't got some Fougere blood in them. It would be very difficult to have Acadian descent around here and not descend from the Fougères. So as you can see, there are still a few little mysteries, although we've managed to sort out in general the descent of Jean Fougere, the descendants through all these different branches of the families and all the different female lines as well as the male lines. But we still have a few little mysteries to clear up, especially regarding the branch in New Brunswick. And hopefully one day we'll find some new records which will clarify the information that we have accumulated to this time. And now, because this is not just the Fougere reunion, but also the Cordeau reunion, I'd like to say a few words about the Cordeaux. Because the Cordeaux are an old family here, particularly in Descousse, but they're, of course, not as old a family in terms of Acadia as the Fougères. In fact, they came along roughly 2 generations later. And we can trace the Cordeaux all back to a Guillaume Cordeau, who was originally from the parish of Sainte-Croix in the Diocese of Bordeaux in France. We don't know when Guillaume Cordeau came here. It's possible that he was already in Cape Breton before the fall of Louisbourg in 1758, although I don't know of any records that show that. We do know that about 10 years later, about 1768, he met a girl named Anne Josse, and he married her. And we know that they had 3 sons and 4 daughters. And the 3 sons, Jean-Nicolas, Élisée, and Urbain, are the ancestors of the Cordeaux. Although we can write off Urbain a little bit in the computations here, because the only son of Urbain who was known to have married is his son Charles. And while he did a good job of marrying, since he was married 3 times, twice in this area and once in Cambridge, Massachusetts. First off, Charles moved away. He moved to Gloucester, Mass., where he died in 1898. And secondly, as far as I've been able to determine, he had only 1 son who died young. So there are no Cordeaux that come from the line of Urbain Cordeau. So all the Cordeaux descend from Jean-Nicolas, who married Scholastique Landry, and his brother Élisée, who married Isabelle Bonnevie de Beaumont and Adelaide Giroir. And the family sort of splits on either side of the passage, because Jean-Nicolas' family lived in Descousse, and Élisée's family mostly lived in River Bourgeois. But as you know, it was possible to cross back and forth over the passage. So you can't just look at the records and say, oh, it divides between the 2 parishes terribly neatly. There were a bit of crossing back and forth. And in case you're really interested in terms of the sweepstakes, it comes out pretty even, but I think the Descousse branch was a little bit ahead in terms of numbers overall. Particularly since Jean-Nicolas had 4 sons and Élisée only had 3. But there is a continuation, obviously. And are there Cordeaux here? Cordeaux! Hi. So that's the story about the Cordeaux. The Cordeaux on the River Bourgeois side, there was André and Joseph and Célestin, who were the 3 sons of Élisée. And Jean-Nicolas had Jean-Baptiste, Noël, Maurice, and Godefroy, who were his 4 sons. And we can trace the family reasonably well. There are a few things that are a little bit doubtful. There's one particular branch of the family that's particularly hard to pin down. And there was a Joseph Cordeau who married Rosalie Petitpot. And Joseph, who married Rosalie Petitpot, married and lived in Descousse. But I don't think he was from here. I think he came from River Bourgeois. because in the 1838 census, we find certain of the families, and there's no place to put him in the Discus Cordeaux. We don't have a marriage record for him. Now, what's complicated here on Ile Madame particularly is that there's so many records missing. The registers in Arichat were burned in 1838. The registers in West Arichat were burned in 1881. The registers in Discus have numerous gaps. And Joseph married to Rosalie Petitpas. Their marriage record apparently fell through one of the gaps. We don't have the record. We can determine relatively easily that Rosalie was the daughter of Vital Petitpas. And that's because the godparents of the children and so forth line up with a connection to Vital Petitpas' family. And the oldest son of the family was named Vital Aimé, named after his grandfather on his mother's side. And the reason why I think this Joseph Cordeau was the son of André Cordeau is because the next son was Joseph André. I think that the two first sons were named for the two grandfathers. They had 5 more sons, and there's lots of Cordeaux in Massachusetts who descend from that family. And one thing that I always find very interesting about these particular Cordeaux is that 2 of the brothers lived in Lynn, Massachusetts. And I haven't been to the spot exactly, but from the addresses in the city directories, it looks like they lived upstairs and downstairs in a duplex. But one of them spelled his name C-O-R-D-E-A-U, and the other one C-U-R-D-O. The 2 brothers in the same house, and they use different names. It kind of makes you wonder whether they had Sunday dinner together or not. But you know, you can choose your friends. And I already said, you know, you're stuck with me because I descend from Jean Fougere 8 times. So that's pretty much what I have to say about that. I just like to thank you very much for your kind attention, and I hope that a few things that I've said might have proved of interest. What's in Acadia? Do you have a passport? Probably not. That's the difficulty. It's not a question of who is an Acadian. It's a question of how can you tell. And that gets to be very tricky. Now, the Acadians, or Acadia, Acadia was a colony of France that existed in the maritime region of, or the Atlantic region of Canada. Unfortunately, the first problem that comes up is that no one ever defined the boundaries of Acadia. And that became a real problem after the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, when Acadia was ceded to the British. The British wanted to know where to put the fence, and nobody knew where the fence line ran. And there were commissions set up, and they wrangled over the border, or where the border should be fixed between Acadia and the French territories that remained, the islands of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, including Ile Royale here, or Cape Breton Island, and Ile Saint-Jean, or Prince Edward Island. That was not a problem. You had the water that separated it. But going over to where I live around New Brunswick, that was a big problem. And it became more and more acute until they had the conflict and the taking of Beauséjour on June 16, 1755. But after the treaty, after the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, which occurred only a few years later, as you all know, and finally the battle in the Chaleur Bay, the Battle of Ristigouche, it didn't matter where the boundary was anymore. So they never settled it. The British got the whole shooting match, and it didn't matter where the boundary was. In the meantime, the operating definition was the French-speaking population in the area that consisted of the former colony of Acadia, the part that was ceded to the British, and it didn't include the people, obviously, in Quebec. And it's questionable as to whether it included the people here on Ile Royale, because normally the people on Ile Royale, after Ile Royale was started, the French administration here realized that the French population here was still French, but Acadia had been ceded to the British, so they couldn't call these people Acadians here, even though beginning in 1713 there were a lot of Acadians who came from Acadia, or the part that was ceded to the British, to come out here to settle on Ile Royale, including Jean Fougere, of course. Now, Jean Fougere was a Frenchman. He was born in France, but he had married in Acadia. We can say that he became an Acadian because of his marriage, and that his descendants are Acadians. Now, some people would say that that might be a little bit doubtful from the fact that the Fougeres were never expelled. That doesn't necessarily mean that the Fougeres are any less Acadian, as far as I'm concerned, because the British tried the best they could to expel the Fougeres and everybody else, but they just didn't manage to get the Fougeres. Now, I don't know if any of you people ever thought of becoming cat burglars or bank robbers, but you know, it might be in the genes, because the Fougeres were obviously pretty slippery and the authorities couldn't catch up to them. So you might think of that as a second career. At any rate, what I'm simply getting at is that there are all sorts of historical facts that come into these things, and there are all kinds of outcomes to them. Now, after the expulsion, we know that when the Acadians were allowed to resettle, they were only allowed to settle in those areas that basically the British population didn't want. If there were enough rocks and you couldn't grow much in it, you could have it. And that's why the Acadian population turned, particularly here, and particularly and generally in eastern Nova Scotia, more to the harvests of the sea than to the harvests of the land. We all know that Acadia, Grand Pre, and Port-Royal, and those areas were very fertile farm areas, and we don't know very much about how much fishing was carried on, but even though there isn't mention of fishing in Grand Pre and fishing in Port-Royal and all that, or very little of it, it's kind of silly to think that there was a Catholic population that didn't have its fish on Friday in those days. But in any event, there were families who came, and there were families who were French in origin, there were families who were Irish in origin, Spanish, and so forth, and they all made up a French-speaking population, which we consider to be Acadian. After the expulsion, when there was the resettling, the question gets a little bit blurred, but there was a French-speaking population that persisted for a long time, and it assimilated into it families of various diverse origins, whether they be named Avery, or whether they be named MacDonald up here on the hill, or whether they be named anything else, Smith, Jones, or whatever have you. And if you don't think we have Jones, you just have to go up to the northeast of New Brunswick. There are Jones there that can't speak any English to you. So, from my perspective, we're all Acadians, if we belong to the Acadian community in the Maritime Provinces or in the Atlantic area, because we can't leave out Newfoundland, because we have a lot of Acadians on the west shore of Newfoundland. And I think that while the ancestry is basically French, the reality today is that much of the descendants is no longer French-speaking, but we're nevertheless of Acadian descent. We're nevertheless the descendants of people who came here and who were Acadian and lived in Acadia and made an Acadian population such as it was and such as it is today. Now, in terms of a more particular definition, some years ago in New Brunswick we held a gathering that was called the Congrès Mondial Acadien, the first one, 1994. And we had a lot of family reunions, and in order to run these family reunions we had to get organized, and in order to get organized and to coordinate all the organization, we had a committee for the family reunions in the Congrès Mondial 1994. And after the Congrès Mondial, that committee had a last meeting and decided that it was kind of too bad to just let go all the network of communication that existed for that organization. And what we did is we established the Federation of Acadian Family Associations, la Fédération des Associations Familles Acadiennes, or the FAFA as we call it. And the FAFA exists still today. We still have a number of family associations that belong to the Federation. But the question was raised, who could apply? What families could apply to become members of the Federation of Acadian Family Associations? We couldn't bring in a family of loyalists who had no Acadian associations. We had to limit ourselves to Acadian families. So I think somebody asked for volunteers, and I didn't hear the question, and everybody stepped back, and I was stuck with making up a definition. And I said that I came up with the idea that any family that had existed for at least 3 generations in an Acadian community in Atlantic Canada would certainly be qualified to become a member. If they formed an association, they could become a member of the Fédération des Associations Familles Acadiennes. The tricky bit in all this is that if you make it many more generations, you exclude families that existed in Acadia prior to the expulsion who were successfully thrown out, who were not quite as slippery as Fougere's, but who were caught by the British and sent away. So we didn't want to exclude them if they wanted to become members of the Federation. We didn't want to exclude families who had been in New Brunswick or in Nova Scotia or in Prince Edward Island or in Newfoundland for quite a number of generations, some of whom might speak French and some who might not, but who might have names that some people wouldn't consider Acadian simply on the strength of the name, because the name didn't exist in Acadia prior to the expulsion. But you know, there are a lot of people with names that are Acadian, but they're not necessarily French. We have a family called Casey in New Brunswick. They've been part of the Acadian community since the 1650s. But they're Irish. But they certainly consider themselves Acadian. And we have families, I was asked a question a little while ago about a family named Fitzgerald, which exists on the other end of Nova Scotia. And they've been in the Acadian community other than Nova Scotia for many generations. So they can be as Acadian as the MacDonalds up here that had Prudence and Tranquilles and Désirés and all sorts of other Séraphins and Ruffins and all the nice old-fashioned French given names, and who couldn't speak English, even though MacDonald is not a French name. So the definition of an Acadian can be quite a large one. I think we can adjourn this general meeting, and then I can entertain questions by those who are interested. I thank you very much for your